My name's Isabel, I'm 32, and honestly, for as long as I can remember, my family has treated me like some ditzy fool without a brain in my head. It didn't matter how hard I worked, how independent I was, or that I carved out a life for myself from scratch. In their minds, I was always going to be the dim-witted little sister who didn't get how the real world worked. Meanwhile, my brother Colin, he's 36, was their golden boy. The favorite. He could screw up left and right and still be showered with praise. Lazy, reckless, full of himself, but in their eyes, he was untouchable. Our grandfather was the one who started the family business from nothing, hoping it'd become a lasting legacy. But over time, my parents took over and eventually handed everything down to Colin. And once he had control, that legacy turned into his personal ATM. The company stopped being a business and became his playground. Every reckless move, every foolish financial decision was brushed aside like it didn't matter, because they truly believed the money would never run out. They thought the business was invincible. I wasn't even in the picture. It's like I didn't exist. I put myself through college, earned a degree on scholarship, found a solid job, and started building my own investments. I didn't live lavishly, but I was stable. Financially secure. But because I wasn't flashy or flaunting wealth the way Colin was, they just assumed I was barely scraping by. In their eyes, not showing off meant I must be struggling. Colin, of course, was handed everything on a silver platter. He never held a job outside of the family company. He threw money around like it grew on trees, taking out loans left and right, always certain mom and dad would bail him out. He splurged on fancy cars, 3-star vacations, and watches that cost more than most people make in a month. The way he lived, you'd think he was royalty. But I could see the cracks. The company wasn't just in trouble, it was sinking. Vendors weren't getting paid on time. Employees were leaving because they weren't receiving their checks. I even heard whispers that banks had started saying no to loan requests. But whenever I brought up my concerns, I got brushed off. You wouldn't understand, my dad would tell me. Business is complicated. Then I learned something that made my stomach twist. They'd rewritten their will. Practically everything, the house we grew up in, the company, whatever assets were left, was going straight to Colin. Turns out that decision had been made long ago. I was cut out, left to fend for myself. Their justification? Isabel wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. It was actually kind of comical, if you think about it. They believed I was too dumb to manage money, while Colin was actively draining the company dry. I gave up on trying to change their minds. Instead, I leaned into the role they cast me in. I played the uninterested little sister, acted clueless about finance, nodded along whenever they patronized me. Let them think I was harmless, naive, completely uninvolved. All the while, I was collecting information. What they didn't realize was that I'd been investing for years. My portfolio was solid. My savings were healthy. I didn't need their money, I had built my own safety net. While they pitted me for what they assumed was financial failure, I was actually in the strongest position out of all of us. Then one of my friends, who works in finance, confirmed what I'd already suspected: the company was on the edge of collapse. Colin had buried it in debt. Massive loans had defaulted, and several lawsuits were hanging over their heads. The only reason it hadn't fully crashed yet was because my parents were still funneling their own money into it, trying to patch the holes. But the banks weren't buying it anymore. Loan applications were getting rejected across the board. Colin's credit was ruined, and even private investors wanted no part of it. That's when my parents started dropping little hints, not full-on asking for help, because that would mean admitting they were wrong, but dancing around the topic. My mom would toss out lines like, "Family should stick together." My dad started talking about how hard times can hit unexpectedly. Colin, of course, stayed quiet. He still thought the universe would bend in his favor, like it always had. Then the bombshell dropped. They finally told me the truth: they weren't just in a rough patch. They were desperate. But instead of coming to me with humility, instead of acknowledging how they'd belittled me for years, they made it sound like I owed them. That it was my responsibility to swoop in and save them. No request, just entitlement. That's when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to flat-out refuse. That would be too simple. They'd just come at me harder, with guilt, manipulation, and accusations of turning my back on family. So I played along. I put on the act. I said I needed time to think it over, said I wasn't sure how all this finance stuff worked. I told them I wanted to understand what I was getting into before I made any decisions. They ate it up. Colin even chuckled and told me not to stress my little head over all that complicated business talk. I smiled, nodded, and kept playing the role they were so comfortable putting me in. Meanwhile, I was already laying the groundwork for payback. I told them I'd help, but with conditions. They jumped at the idea, thinking I'd just hand over a blank check. But I made it clear, I needed to understand the business first. I played it innocent, saying stuff like, I don't really know much about money, but if I'm investing, shouldn't I at least try to learn? Colin practically laughed in my face. Sure, knock yourself out, he said, waving me off like I was some little kid pretending to be grown up. My parents looked relieved, thinking I was finally falling in line. They handed me the company's financial records, never imagining I'd actually read them. I was just supposed to glance over them, nod a few times, and then cough up my savings like a good little sister. Instead, I combed through every page. Hours of review. And what I found was worse than I ever expected. There were massive debts going back years. Suppliers had been neglected. Lawsuits were piling up from vendors who were misled with broken promises. Colin had gambled everything, using the company as collateral, betting it would always bounce back. He wasn't just spending recklessly, he was risking everything, again and again, like he couldn't lose. When I returned the papers, I kept my expression neutral. I even forced a small smile and said, "Wow, that's impressive," like I was genuinely amazed. "I never realized running a business was so intense," I said, feigning wide-eyed wonder. "You guys must be geniuses to juggle all this." Colin grinned like a kid getting a gold star, clearly loving the flattery. My parents looked downright smug, like they'd finally gotten through to their wayward daughter and earned her respect. But what they didn't know was that I had already found my entry point. A small but potent legal loophole. Years back, when my grandfather started the business, he'd issued shares to early investors. Many of those folks had either passed away or moved on without ever claiming ownership. The records were buried deep in old filings, ignored and forgotten, because no one in my family thought anyone would care enough to look. Quietly and carefully, I started buying those orphaned shares, through shell companies and low-key transactions, so no one would think twice. Every piece I acquired gave me more control. The idea that I'd dig into the company's ownership structure never even crossed their minds. As far as they were concerned, I was still the disinterested little sister who couldn't balance a checkbook. But little by little, I was shifting the balance of power. To plan my next step, I reached out to Miles, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud. The guy had built a career exposing shady bookkeeping and financial disasters, and I knew if anyone could help me unravel Colin's chaos, it was him. I framed it as a casual investment inquiry, but I trusted he'd read between the lines. Sure enough, Miles combed through the numbers and came back with a grim warning. The company wasn't just in rough shape, it was circling the drain. The debt was far worse than anyone had let on. And the worst part? Colin had been doctoring documents to make it all look better on paper. False profits, inflated numbers, forged reports, the works. Investors were being conned. One deep dive, and the whole facade would crumble. Colin had built a castle out of sand and convinced himself it was steel. Still, he carried on like nothing was wrong, bought himself a brand new car, claiming it was part of his executive image. Took another luxury vacation and posted every 3-star moment like he was some lifestyle influencer. All I did was watch. The deeper he sank, the quieter I became. Meanwhile, my parents started turning up the heat. At first, they couched it in gentle terms, just a small contribution to help out. But before long, they were pushing for me to cover real bills, the mortgage, employee paychecks, even Colin's ridiculous business travel. They thought I'd nod and go along without blinking. So I played the game. I said I was open to helping but wanted to talk specifics first, made it sound like I was just being cautious, trying to be a responsible adult about a major financial decision. They practically leapt at the offer. A meeting was set almost immediately. Colin looked smug, my parents looked relieved, and I could tell they thought they had me right where they wanted. That's when Miles uncovered something even worse. Buried in the documents was a contract. My parents had used their home as collateral for one of Colin's massive loans. There were overdue notices from the bank, ignored emails, unanswered calls. They thought, as always, that Colin would swoop in and fix it last minute. But this time, the bank wasn't waiting around. Foreclosure was already underway. They weren't just in trouble, they were standing on a trapdoor, and Colin was jumping on it. Quietly, I began contacting some of the remaining shareholders, just casual questions, nothing alarming. But the financials were already making people nervous. Colin, still thinking I was harmless, continued brushing me off like I was a kid playing CEO. That's when I decided to make my first real move. At the next meeting, I sat across from them, smiled sweetly, and said I was ready to invest, on one condition. I wanted a controlling interest. A major stake in the company. That finally gave them pause. Colin chuckled, but he didn't say no. He still thought he was in charge, assuming I had no clue what I was asking for. My parents, too desperate to see straight, told him it was just a formality, that they could always guide me later. Eventually, after some awkward silence, they agreed. They truly thought they'd won. What they didn't realize was they had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. They thought they were manipulating me. Instead, they had unknowingly set the stage for their own downfall. As soon as the ink dried on those papers, everything changed. I was no longer the clueless little sister. I was a legal force at the table, with the right to access financials, approve decisions, and initiate changes. Colin barely looked up when I joined the boardroom table. My parents gave each other hopeful glances, thinking I was finally stepping up to help the family. They had no idea I was about to tear it all down. The very next morning, I brought in an outside auditor, completely independent, no ties to the family. Someone who would go line by line through every record without blinking. And just like that, the red flags started lighting up. Hidden debts. Falsified income reports. Gaping holes where money had mysteriously vanished, straight into Colin's personal expenses. By the time we got the first round of audit results, Colin was already sensing something was wrong. He tried to play it cool during meetings, brushing off discrepancies as clerical errors. But behind the scenes, I knew he was panicking. He started shredding documents. Deleting emails. Trying to cover tracks that were already gone. But it was far too late. Word spread quickly. Investors who'd already been skeptical began pulling out. Suppliers stopped extending credit. Employees whispered in hallways, sharing stories that painted Colin as reckless and incompetent. The cracks in his so-called empire weren't just showing, they were bursting open. So I took control of the story. I arranged for a formal company statement. In it, I positioned myself as the one stepping up to stabilize and save the business. I didn't name names, but the subtext was loud and clear. Under new leadership, we were turning the page. The staff, who had spent years under Colin's chaotic rule, immediately took notice. Meetings became more productive. Paychecks went out on time. I made it very clear, there would be no more tolerance for failure. And just like that, the loyalty started to shift. Colin, realizing he was losing control, tried to push back. He called an emergency meeting, hoping to restructure leadership and sideline me. But he had already signed away too much. He couldn't stop me now. Then came the legal storm. Thanks to Miles's deep dive, we had uncovered enough financial fraud to make even seasoned investors furious. What Colin had done wasn't just sloppy, it was illegal. Misleading investors, fabricating records, it was the kind of thing that gets people in serious trouble. Once the bank fully grasped the chaos unfolding, they wasted no time starting the repossession process on my parents' house. That's when the panic really set in. The same people who had treated me like an extra piece of furniture for years were now frantically scrambling. The moment their credit cards got declined and foreclosure notices started piling up, they finally realized this wasn't just a rough patch. But it wasn't guilt that hit them, it was fear. Fear of losing comfort. Fear of having to face the reality they'd been avoiding for so long. And suddenly, I was supposed to be their solution. They didn't ask for help, they demanded it. You have to fix this. Your family. You owe us. Even in total collapse, they couldn't find it in themselves to speak to me with respect. I played the part. I acted like I was torn up about it, unsure whether to help or walk away. Let them believe I was seriously considering bailing them out. But in truth, I was wrapping up the final steps of my plan. Then Colin, in what I can only describe as a last, delusional attempt to regain control, decided to sue me. He accused me of misleading him, claimed I tricked him into signing away company shares. He thought the court would side with him, believed his charm would carry him through like always. But what he didn't grasp was that filing the lawsuit meant opening Pandora's box. It triggered a legal requirement to examine every financial record. Every lie, every forgery, every shady deal Colin had buried was now in the hands of professionals. The judge tossed the case so fast, it was almost comical. Not only did Colin lose, but in the process, he exposed himself as a fraud. There was no more pretending. He was officially ruined. The fallout came hard and fast. Investors yanked their money out. Creditors showed up demanding what was owed. The company's value nosedived overnight. And those employees who had stayed loyal? They finally saw him for who he really was. Then came the final blow, an eviction notice. My parents, still clutching to this fantasy that it would all work out somehow, were forced to wake up. The bank was taking their home. Their savings? Gone. Colin had burned through everything. That was the first time I saw genuine fear in their eyes when they looked at me. And you know what? I could have stepped in. I had the money. I could have paid off the debts, rescued the business, even helped them keep the house. But I didn't. They'd made their bed. Now it was time they slept in it. The collapse triggered by Colin's failed lawsuit didn't let up. The few remaining investors dropped out, suppliers ended contracts, and the last wave of employees started jumping ship. The company name had become poison, synonymous with failure and fraud. And Colin? He unraveled completely. He had a full-on breakdown at the office one day. Screamed at everyone, accused the staff of betrayal, and shouted that I had destroyed everything. He was used to being the golden boy, the one people scrambled to protect. But there was no one left to save him. So I finished what I started. As a major shareholder, I called an emergency board meeting. I had every right to request a vote on his position, and honestly, it wasn't even a fight. The entire board had seen the financial wreckage. The vote was unanimous. Colin was officially ousted. Of course, he didn't go quietly. He begged, threatened, made last-ditch promises. But his name was radioactive by then. No one was willing to gamble their future on a man who'd wrecked everything. And once he was out, the rest unraveled fast. The banks, already watching him like a hawk, swooped in. His luxury SUV, paid for with borrowed money, was towed away in broad daylight, right outside the office. The staff watched in silence as his prized toy disappeared. But true to form, Colin didn't take any responsibility. He turned on me instead. He immediately launched into a smear campaign, calling up every distant cousin and family friend, spinning a story where I was the villain. According to him, I'd tricked my way into control, robbed the family blind, and left our parents in the dust. And, of course, my parents backed him up. They went around telling anyone who would listen that I had betrayed them, that I'd turned my back on the people who raised me. Funny how they never mentioned the rewritten will. Or the years they spent handing everything to Colin while treating me like I was disposable. At first, I ignored it. I knew exactly how they operated. Their hope was that public pressure and family shame would wear me down. But karma doesn't always take its time. Colin's landlord, seeing all the headlines and the mess, decided not to take any risks. With no job, no income, and a terrible credit rating, Colin couldn't keep up with rent. He made excuses, swore up and down about an imaginary business deal that would change everything, but it never came. Eventually, he had to pack his bags and leave. And his credit? Completely wrecked. By that point, I'd had enough. I wasn't going to let him drag my name through the mud while pretending he was the victim. I called my lawyer and filed an official fraud complaint. It protected me legally, and it cracked things wide open. Now it wasn't just private investors watching him. Law enforcement was involved. Then one day, there they were, my parents, standing on my doorstep. No smug looks, no snide comments. Just desperation. This time, they didn't hint. They didn't guilt trip. They begged. Begged me to let Colin back into the company. Pleaded for me to give him one more shot. They still thought he was worth saving. I didn't lecture them. Didn't raise my voice or explain the mountain of damage he'd caused. I just looked them in the eye and said, "You made your choice. Now live with it." Then I closed the door. And finally, the tide began to shift. People in the extended family who had bought into Colin's lies started connecting the dots. The court records didn't lie. The eviction was real. And then Colin, in a pathetic final move, tried one last stunt. He attempted to sell off company assets, furniture, equipment, anything not bolted down, to scrape together money. He thought no one would stop him, that he still had the power he used to. But I'd already locked everything down. His attempted sale was blocked immediately. And once word got out about what he tried to do, even more people turned away from him. He wasn't just reckless, he was desperate and dangerous. Whatever scrap of credibility Colin had left crumbled with the court's final ruling. His lawsuit against me was officially dismissed, and with that, his last shot at clawing his way back into the company vanished for good. It was time to make it official. I released a formal statement, announcing a company-wide restructuring under new leadership. No mudslinging. No names. Just a clean, professional reset from the chaos he'd left behind. And it worked. Investors who had been holding their breath started cautiously reaching back out. Employees, too. Folks who had been unsure about what came next were finally starting to believe in a future that didn't involve Colin steering everything into a ditch. Meanwhile, Colin was left with nothing. No home. No job. No money. And thanks to the scandal, he was effectively blacklisted in every business circle that mattered. But I wasn't done. Even after losing it all, my parents still clung to this ridiculous fantasy that Colin would somehow rise from the ashes. That it was just a rough patch. That with a little more support, he'd bounce back, rebuild his image, and reclaim his empire. And in their minds, I was the reason he hadn't. I was the villain, the traitor who took advantage of her brother at his weakest, who turned her back on family during their darkest hour. But none of their spin mattered anymore. I had control now. And I intended to use it. With Colin out, I moved forward with a full restructuring of the company. And that meant cutting out everyone who had helped him wreck it, including my own parents. For years, they treated the business like it was their personal piggy bank, draining funds without hesitation, assuming they'd have a say in everything for the rest of their lives. But that era was over. The day the paperwork was finalized, they were officially stripped of all authority. Their names were removed from every financial account, every board seat, every lever of power they thought they'd hold forever. And they did not take it well. Suddenly, they were calling nonstop. Sending emails. Demanding sit-downs. At one point, they even tried showing up at the office, but security turned them away at the front door. And then, reality started hitting. Without access to the company's money, their lavish lifestyle ground to a halt. All those designer purchases, the fancy dinners, the weekend escapes, they'd never actually paid for them. And now the creditors were circling, this time unwilling to wait. Worst of all, their beloved home, the one they'd used as collateral for Colin's loans, was now in the foreclosure process. They hadn't made a mortgage payment in months, still banking on the idea that I'd swoop in and bail them out. But the bank was done waiting. That's when the guilt calls started pouring in. First, my mother, trying to play the sentimental card. She brought up old family vacations, birthdays, anything she thought would soften me. She kept saying things like, "We're still a family. Family sticks together, Isabel." Then came my father, stern and condescending as ever. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "One day you'll look back and regret turning your back on your blood." When neither tactic worked, they recruited reinforcements. Cousins, aunts, old family friends, I got messages from all directions. Some tried to guilt-trip me. Others claimed they were neutral and just wanted to see peace. But it was obvious my parents had spun the same sob story to everyone. I didn't argue. I didn't try to set the record straight. I just reminded them all of one simple fact: my parents had never once supported me. And then I hung up. The consequences came swiftly. Word of their fall from grace spread like wildfire. People who used to envy them, the wealth, the image, the supposed success, saw the truth now. They weren't victims. They were failures. And no one wanted to be associated with them anymore. Then came my final move. As the bank was getting ready to auction off their home, I quietly stepped in through a third-party investor. I made sure everything was handled discreetly, layers of legal protection between me and the deal. The sale went through without a whisper of my name attached. They only realized the truth when they tried to negotiate with the new owner, and found out it was me. You could see it on their faces. The shock. The horror. They were officially homeless, and the person who now held the deed to their old kingdom was the daughter they'd ignored, belittled, and dismissed. They begged. They pleaded. They said they'd forgive everything if I just let them move back in. My mother swore she hadn't meant the cruel things she said. My father promised they'd changed. But I didn't budge. Instead, I rented the house out to a young family. And my parents had no choice but to watch strangers live in the home they used to brag about. Meanwhile, Colin's downward spiral didn't stop. He tried crushing on friends' couches, but people had already heard the stories. He wasn't just broke, he was toxic. One by one, even his closest allies cut him off. And then, as expected, my parents made one final attempt. They came to my door. No more masks. No more games. This was their last-ditch effort to convince me that forgiveness was possible. My father forced a polite tone. My mother offered a weak smile. They acted like all this could somehow still be repaired. But it couldn't. My entire life, I'd been second best. My achievements were dismissed, my worth constantly compared to Colin's. Nothing I did ever measured up. And now, after everything, they finally needed me. So I left them on the doorstep. I walked away. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. With my parents and Colin fully out of the picture, I poured all my energy into rebuilding the company. For decades, they had drained it dry, treating it like a toy, a status symbol, a source of endless cash. The employees had been overlooked, overworked, and treated like they didn't matter. Now, all that was changing. The first thing I did was clean house. Every single person who had enabled Colin, covered for him, or benefited from his lies, they were gone. Some tried to defend themselves. A few tried to guilt me into keeping them around. But I didn't entertain it. They were out. Then I turned to the people who had stuck it out, the ones who stayed when things were falling apart, the ones who still believed in what the company could be. I sat down with them. I listened. And we started from scratch. We rebuilt with better leadership, smarter strategies, and real accountability. Within a year, the turnaround was undeniable. The company, once circling the drain thanks to Colin's recklessness, was not only stable, it was thriving. Profits hit all-time highs. What had nearly collapsed under his mismanagement was now stronger than it had ever been. Investors came back. Partnerships that had gone cold suddenly warmed up. The business, once whispered about with pity and skepticism, was now being hailed as a success story. A powerhouse. And the people on the inside? They felt it too. Employees who used to dread walking through those doors were now motivated, respected, and properly compensated. Some even joked openly that getting rid of Colin was the best business decision we'd ever made. While the company soared, Colin floundered. He tried to find work in the same industry, but nobody would touch him. His name was tainted. Too many people had seen the destruction he left behind, and no one was willing to take that gamble. Still, he refused to face the truth. He walked around like he was still top dog, convinced that the right opportunity would fall into his lap. But no offers came. One by one, the few friends he had left started ghosting him. The money dried up. The favors stopped. And he had nothing to fall back on. My parents weren't doing much better. For the first time in their lives, they had to actually live within their means. The fancy house? Gone. Company credit cards? Gone. Easy money? Gone. They moved into a tiny apartment, far from the luxurious life they were used to. No more lavish dinners or spontaneous weekend getaways. Just basic living, and the sting of realizing how unprepared they were for it. Then came the apologies. One by one, the extended family members who had sided with Colin started crawling back. Some offered actual apologies. Others pretended they'd never taken a side to begin with. I wasn't bitter. But I wasn't stupid either. I accepted some apologies, but I never forgot who had shown their true colors. They'd chosen Colin when it counted. And that mattered. Then Colin, in what might have been his most delusional move yet, tried launching his own business. He had no capital, no backing, no experience outside of the mess he left behind. But he pressed forward anyway, driven by ego and the belief that if I could succeed, he could outdo me. It fell apart in a matter of months. The failure was so public and so pathetic that even people who used to sing his praises now laughed behind his back. The industry didn't just reject him, it mocked him. And that's when it finally hit my parents. After all those years of choosing Colin, of treating me like an afterthought, they realized they'd gambled everything on the wrong child. I was the one who built something. I was the one who survived. And Colin? He was no one. No income. No business. No support. He faded from the social circles he used to dominate, while I stepped fully into a life I had created with no help from them. Sometime later, I bumped into an old family friend, someone who'd seen the entire saga unfold from the sidelines. They mentioned how my parents had finally admitted their mistakes. That they regretted everything. That they wished they could go back and change it all. Then they asked me, was it too late? I didn't respond with bitterness. I didn't explain. I just smiled and walked away. Because I had already built a life without them. And I wouldn't change a single thing. But Colin wasn't finished trying to drag me down. In a final, pathetic attempt to regain some kind of leverage, he tried to blackmail me. Through a mutual acquaintance, he claimed to have evidence that I manipulated my way into control. That I had tricked him into signing over his shares. That I orchestrated the company's downfall. It was laughable. Everything I had done was legal. Every document, every signature, every move had been above board. I hadn't done anything shady, I just outsmarted him at every turn. I didn't even bother speaking to him directly. I had my lawyer send him a cease and desist notice with a clear message: if he made one more false accusation, he'd be facing a defamation lawsuit. He backed off. Quiet, for about a week. Then his next stunt showed up online. A GoFundMe. The title? Victim of Corporate Sabotage, Help Me Rebuild My Life. In it, he painted himself as the fallen hero of some business tragedy. Claimed I betrayed him. Said I stole everything. That I destroyed him. He begged for donations. Claimed he just needed a little help to get back on his feet. But no one fell for it. Instead of sympathy, he got roasted. People from the business world, former employees, even people he barely knew, flooded the comments with reminders of what he'd done. Screenshots of his reckless spending, the lawsuits, the luxury trips, it all came back to bite him. The fundraiser lasted only a few days before he took it down in embarrassment. With nothing left, he turned to the corporate world, trying to land a steady job. But that door had long since closed. His resume was a red flag. His reputation was toxic. Every interview ended in rejection. He had become a cautionary tale in business circles. Meanwhile, my parents kept clinging to their last hope, that somehow, some way, Colin would bounce back. But after watching him fail again and again, even they began to break. And like him, they came crawling back, to me. They showed up at my office, not unannounced, thankfully. I had already instructed security to keep things calm. But they requested a meeting, and I agreed. Not out of compassion, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see just how far they had fallen. They were overly polite. Awkwardly nice. It was the first time they had ever spoken to me without that familiar condescending tone. And then came the real blow, they asked me for jobs. My parents. The same people who treated me like I was worthless. Now asking me to hire them. I didn't miss a beat. I told them I only employ people who take responsibility for their failures. They scrambled. Tried to justify. Tried to apologize. Said they finally saw my worth. That they had been wrong. That they regretted everything. But I saw straight through it. It wasn't about respect. It was about survival. They didn't value me. They needed me. And now that they had nothing left, they thought they could rewrite history. I told them to leave. And not to come back. Without me, they had nowhere else to turn. No money, no allies, no lifeline left. Last I heard, they ended up in a cramped little apartment, a far cry from the mansion they used to brag about like it was some badge of honor. And Colin? He vanished. No job. No home. No support. He disappeared off the map. His social media? Deleted. His network? Burned. Nobody knew where he went. And truthfully? I didn't lose a second of sleep over it. Colin had already lost everything that mattered, his job, his home, every relationship he'd ever leaned on. But just when I thought he couldn't sink any lower, the past came knocking. One of his old business partners, the same guy he had screwed over years ago, decided it was finally time to return the favor. He leaked everything. Financial records. Email threads. Hard proof that Colin had been cooking the books, faking profits, and conning investors into thinking the company was booming when it was hanging by a thread. At first, it stayed behind closed doors, passed quietly between industry insiders as a cautionary tale. But then a financial news site picked up the story, and just like that, Colin's downfall became headline material. He was a punchline. People in the business world started mocking him openly. His name became shorthand for failure. Memes, parodies, LinkedIn posts dripping with sarcasm, it didn't stop. Former coworkers joined in too, confirming what everyone now knew: Colin wasn't just incompetent. He was dangerous. More people came forward. Employees shared nightmare stories of unpaid wages and verbal tirades. Ex-girlfriends aired out his manipulative behavior and his endless lies. Even distant relatives spoke up, recalling how he had borrowed money and never paid it back, always expecting others to fix what he broke. Whatever slim chance he had of salvaging his image was gone. And my parents? They panicked. For years, they had shielded Colin. Defended him. Praised him. Enabled him. Now that he was toxic, they scrambled to save face. They told anyone who would listen that they had no clue what he was doing, that they, too, had been blindsided. Nobody bought it. Everyone remembered. These were the same parents who had handed him the reins, shut me out, and told the world he was the only one fit to lead. Now they were choking on their own blind loyalty. But I still wasn't done. The company, my company, still bore their name. A name stained by years of neglect and failure. If I was going to move forward, I needed to close that chapter for good. So I rebranded. New name. New leadership. Clean slate. I cut every last string tying us to the past. Then I released a final public statement. Calm. Direct. No drama. Just a simple announcement: the company had successfully restructured, recovered from previous mismanagement, and was moving forward built on transparency, strength, and ethics. I never mentioned Colin or my parents. I didn't need to. The message was crystal clear: they were out, and the company was thriving without them. Still trying to prove he wasn't finished, Colin made one last pathetic attempt to start a business. It flopped before it even got off the ground. No investors. No loans. No interest. The second his name was attached, people ran the other way. Within months, it collapsed. Publicly. Loudly. Embarrassingly. Even the last few people in his corner finally gave up. And then the final blow came: he filed for bankruptcy. Completely broke. No savings. No assets. No credibility left. As for my parents? Their entire social life crumbled. The people they used to show off to, the ones they tried so hard to impress, now wanted nothing to do with them. They weren't just poor, they were irrelevant. The home, the power, the carefully curated image, it was all gone. And once again, they came to me. But this time, they didn't ask for help. They didn't beg for money. They just said they missed me. That they regretted everything. So I sent them one last message. You made your choices. Now live with them. Then I blocked them for good. No second chances. No open doors. I had built a life without them, and I never looked back. Years passed. And Colin stayed exactly where he'd left himself, rock bottom. Every few months, I'd hear whispers of his next big idea. A startup here, a side hustle there. All of them failed. Investors wanted nothing to do with him. He'd burned too many bridges. Lied to too many people. Every time he thought he had something, it blew up in his face. With no income, no prospects, and no credibility, he drifted. Couch to couch, city to city. A shadow of the man he used to pretend to be. And my parents? They became ghosts. The ones they used to brag to, the ones who once envied their lifestyle, had all moved on. They weren't invited anywhere. They weren't part of any conversation that mattered. Their names meant nothing now. And me? I built everything they said I never would. I bought my dream home. just mine. A quiet, beautiful place far from the chaos they once brought into my life. I traveled, saw the world, lived without apology. Surrounded myself with real friends. Honest people. People who didn't care about status or money, just connection. And the company? It flourished. Without the weight of their greed and Colin's recklessness, it became something great. Profits kept rising. Deals kept closing. Employees stayed, grew, thrived. The culture changed. The entire atmosphere shifted. People finally saw what had been holding us back all along. Them. And Colin? He never changed. Not once. Every now and then, I'd hear little updates from people we both used to know, mutual contacts who hadn't quite cut him off entirely. They'd say Colin was still bitter. Still clinging to the same tired story that I had stolen something from him. That I'd wrecked his life. But no one believed it. Not anymore. Nobody took seriously the words of a man who had destroyed his own world with his own hands. His credibility was shot. His story? Just noise. And then, at long last, my parents got it. I didn't hear it from them directly, of course. But word traveled through distant relatives, the kind who still kept tabs on everyone even if they pretended not to. In their quiet, private moments, my parents finally admitted the truth. They had backed the wrong horse. They'd spent a lifetime placing all their faith, all their money, all their hopes into Colin. They made excuse after excuse. Sacrificed everything to prop him up. And in the end, he had nothing to show for it. Me? I had everything they thought he would achieve. But by the time the realization sank in, it didn't matter anymore. I had stopped caring a long time ago. All the pressure they used to put on me, the criticism, the disappointment, the way they looked through me like I wasn't enough, it had evaporated. The weight was gone. I was free. And the most satisfying part? I never had to lift a finger to destroy them. I didn't plot. I didn't sabotage. I didn't take them down. They did it all themselves. They set the fire. I just walked away from the smoke. Even when I knew, deep down, that they were sorry, even when I heard they missed me. I never opened that door again. I didn't answer their calls. I never replied to the messages. I gave them no second chances. Instead, I built something they never could. A real family. Not one tied together by guilt or appearances, but by love, loyalty, and genuine support. A life that didn't revolve around proving myself to people who never deserved me. And then, one day, it happened. I ran into my father. It was completely unplanned, just an average afternoon, an ordinary trip to the store. But the second I saw him, I knew. It wasn't just that he'd aged. He looked worn out. Tired in a way that went deeper than wrinkles or gray hair. He looked like a man who had spent everything and come up empty. And when he saw me, God, the way his face lit up, you could tell, just for a split second, he thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was his moment. He opened his mouth to speak. But I didn't stop walking. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I didn't even blink. I walked right past him. No words. No nod. Not even a glance. Because I didn't need anything from him anymore. Not closure. Not an apology. Not recognition. I had already won. They called me the dumb one. The forgettable one. The girl who'd never understand how the real world worked. But the truth? I was always smarter than all of them.